Welcome back. We're in a very special conversation this morning with Jim O'Neill. He is the former Treasury Minister, former chair at Goldman Sachs Asset Management, and currently chair of Chatham House as well. Great to get his perspective on all that's happening, particularly with that resounding mandate. Jim, thanks so much for joining us. To kick start with, let's talk about the fact that we've, got the new government come into power. It's been, a clear mandate coming in, and the big talking point currently is, of course, who Modi is going to bring into his new cabinet, what that will mean going ahead for reforms as well. I want to get your sense of really how blown away by this vote were you, and secondly, what are you hoping to see in terms of key reforms now going forward?
So, with the caveat that I am a bit removed from following the markets as closely as I once did, and not following the BRIC countries hour by hour. With that caveat, it's obviously quite a large endorsement of what Modi sort of represents in its broadest sense. It seems to me it's probably more to do with his nationalist, bold, spirited tendencies than anything he's done on economics or finance. However, I would hope that now that he's got such a big mandate for a second term, he tries to pursue with greater boldness some of the big structural challenges that separate India from possibly growth of 8, 9, or even 10% or more, and something that would lift tens of millions of more Indian people out of poverty and accelerate India's rise to being one of the largest economies in the world. But of course, to do those things is not easy. But if you've got the kind of mandate that Modi seems to have got, this is the best time that India has in a way. So ranging from things to do with education and health, all the way through to more serious financial market reform.
Okay, so let's go a little deeper into that then, Jim. What are some of these key reforms, whether they be structural reforms or financial, that you feel he can really push ahead with now that he's gotten this mandate?
So I think, I guess I'd describe it as a more transparent and a more powerful market signal-based financial system. It often seems that the banking system and the credit system and the allocation of capital in India is a bit sort of shrouded in a lot of unclear signals. And of course, with India being and beautifully demonstrated in this election, the biggest democracy in the world, I think in principle should be easier for India to accelerate its financial system to be a little bit more like those in Western markets. At times, it sometimes seems a little bit like the Chinese financial system. And I think one of the things that concerns international investors at this moment about India is whether there is a lot more underlying unpayable debt embodied in the financial system than is transparent. But it's very hard for anybody to know because it's not clear how the price mechanism and the allocation of capital really happens. So it would be, of course, in some ways, it would be risky for any leader to do that. But I think it would be as good a time as any if India is going to go down that path to pursue them more aggressively now.
So, Jim, on one hand, we've seen what's perceived to be a substantial cleanup of the system. On the other hand, there is still a sense of impending risk and still some uncertainty, when it comes to particularly the NBFC front. Are you then saying that you're anticipating tremendous risk when it comes to the financial system?
I'm not sure if I describe it as tremendous risks. It's just very hard to really understand what are the risks. It's all a bit murky and unclear. And I think it's, obviously part of it is to do with the whole role the state banks play and the interplay between them and other parts of the financial system, including what superficially appears to be the more genuinely private, freer financial institutions. But if India is going to develop full confidence in global finance and to develop a truly efficient financial system that would be commensurate with India's soon to be fifth largest economy in the world type status on its way to the third, you would imagine a more transparent and clearer financial system is something that the leadership should aspire to, not least because if they don't, problems and rigidities in the financial system might stop the ability for India to rise up the economic progress chart and restrict the wealth of India in general, but more importantly, individual Indian people. But it's all a bit murky. It's hard for me to. I wouldn't describe myself as being particularly concerned about the risk of it tomorrow, but as you say, it's been an issue in recent months, and I can see why people have some of these concerns.
So what then, Jim, are the tangible to-dos in order to make this happen for, the global financial system to really look at India more legitimately, as you said? I mean, we're already one of the world's largest economies. How do we also become a more credible one?
So on sort of more, let's call it cyclical issues, but they also, the ideas I would suggest relate to structural policy. As I think we've talked about before, and I've certainly written about before, I think given the generally reasonably credible job Modi's presided over in terms of the fiscal framework, I think they should develop a more ambitious framework for fiscal policy, a bit like something the UK had in the early days of Tony Blair when Gordon Brown was the British finance minister, and used to call it the so-called golden rule, in which they allowed them to separate government spending devoted towards long-term investments from government spending on what economists would call typically consumption. And I think in India's case, it's so vital because the scale of the infrastructure challenge, and as part of that, I'd include, crucially for India, education and health and infectious disease prevention. I think India needs much bigger government-backed investments in these things, but it can't really do it under the simplistic overall fiscal framework it has, where it just concentrates on headline budget deficits and levels of debt. Whereas if it shifted to one that, in addition to having headline debt and headline deficits, it actually had an additional subcomponent for deficit and debt, excluding government investment spending, and then ones including government investment spending. And I think it would, apart from it being very transparent, and because of it being transparent, I think it would give Indian policymakers more scope to be more ambitious about using government spending to actually lift the long-term growth trend through investments. And I think Modi's probably in a, what I'm saying is quite a radical, ambitious thing, but I would have thought, given the strength of his success, he's in a position to consider doing things like that. I would also like to see more on monetary policy, more to a genuine degree of independence for the central bank and less interference with what's going on in the central bank's decisions.
So a more ambitious agenda, and yes, we are used to seeing this government come out with some, big announcements on reforms. What route do you think they're going to take, Jim? We've, of course, waiting for the cabinet announcement. We've also got the budget coming up. Everyone's tuning in to hear about, anything at all on government spending, privatization. What route do you expect him to take?
If there were any plans to have these kind of ambitions, it would be very sensible to start giving the framework for them in the earliest time they can, and obviously either at or ahead of the first budget of a new government. And if you want to change to a slightly more ambitious, albeit credible framework, that's the time to do it. Again, obviously the comparisons are very difficult, if not particularly valid. But I think back to when Tony Blair first became Prime Minister in the UK, and they introduced quite a new radical framework for policy for an ambitious government, including, of course, in that time, making the Bank of England independent. And I can't see why, if Modi is going to do those kind of things, and I've no idea whether he's thinking them or not, but if he were, it would be the right time to consider doing it. On privatizations, it's again, how many times over the years have we had these conversations? It's same thing. And the other area I find my mind going through, which wouldn't, I don't think, require it to be done at a budget, but I'd like to see India under Modi developing more genuine ambition when it comes to trade with key trade partners. I read with interest over the weekend that he and the Pakistani leader had a nice telephone conversation. But I would love to see India making bold, creative suggestions about trying to pursue, let's call it at least a normal, if not a very ambitious, positive trade relationship with Pakistan, to completely change the framework of the difficulties that have been between those two countries for the past, almost endless years. And similarly with China, this is a sort of particularly out of the box one, but I think about it both from a Chinese perspective and from an Indian perspective. As your viewers know, China has this very ambitious project called One Belt, One Road, or BRI as it's known these days. But I think the Chinese have had some problems with it in the past couple of years, and they know that they've had problems and they need to adapt it. And crucially, linked to my idea, bring in other important Asian neighbouring countries to have some influence in shaping the BRI. And to my knowledge, Modi has not actually yet directly participated in any BRI meetings with Beijing. But why not make some suggestion about India taking a more direct involvement in it? Because when I stand back, and I've written about this a long time ago, that if India was more strongly positioned in the middle of a dramatically rising trade relationship between the likes of China, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and so on, it not only would it be fantastic for all those countries, but it would have a transformative impact on world trade and make a lot of the things we all sit around worrying about all day with Trump and America seem much less relevant and things we wouldn't worry about so much. We don't have to live in a world where everything is so dependent on what the US president thinks.
Just to touch upon, the earlier part of your answer again, Jim, and I sensed a lot of ifs and buts there. Actually, you're not hidden at all your doubts about what the new government will do. But I guess my other question is on whether or not it's changed perception, or you feel the mandate has a potential to change perception on India. The fact that, is there a consensus or belief that he could deliver this time? On the back of that, will we actually start to see, a lot more in terms of FDI flows, for instance? What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, again, let's link it back to 5 years ago when he first won. I think then it was a bit of a genuine surprise. There was a lot of hope about the kind of reforms I've just said, but even more so, a large amount of hope about major FDI reforms and a lot of privatizations, which by and large never came. So I'm not sure in the near term international investors are going to be particularly more hopeful or excited about those kind of developments unless we get a clear signal from Modi himself or some of the key people he announces in his cabinet that this is what they now want to do more seriously along the lines of what so many people were hoping for 5 years ago. I remember, and I think you know, and your view, I myself had direct conversations with Modi before he even announced he was running, and I was very taken in with the whole sort of tone of what they implied they were going to do. But as it related to things like this, they never really came through on delivering any of these policies. So I can't imagine why investors today will necessarily be more hopeful about those things just because Modi's had a big majority. But at the same time, linked to what I said about all the other areas I've mentioned, he is in a position with such a big victory to consider more dramatic reform-minded policy initiatives, including boosting FDI.
Okay, let's talk about China then. The entire trade tussle, how seriously damaging do you see this being for global markets, as well as India, of course? And perhaps, if we take a different perspective, do you actually see more money moving towards India and Indian businesses as a result?
So I think you have to separate out two different issues about China. First of all, I mean, the truth of the matter is, there's probably 50 issues about China we should talk about, but on the really big ones that indirectly or directly are relevant for India, first of all, there's the issue of the so-called trade war with the United States, and then separately is the whole issue about what's happening to China's own domestic economy. On the trade war, I have to be honest, somewhat contradictory thoughts in my head over the weekend and today. It seems to me that Trump, by nature, given his background and his personality, almost definitely is going to try and negotiate some kind of trade deal. So I wouldn't be so bothered about it in the near term. But the contradictory part is I think because under Trump there's been so much focus on this in the US politically, and it's become such a broader issue that it's sort of opened this broader, slightly strange issue where America almost now seeming really worried about the possibility that China might become a bigger economy than them, and goading some US policymakers on, perhaps even more than Trump, to try and stop that happening with China, which is kind of ridiculous, but also rather dangerous for everybody, because as it translates into the rest of the world, and again, as I've said many a time in the past few months, so far this decade, 85% of global GDP has come from those two places. So if they're going to start putting more and more tariffs on each other, there's no two ways about it. It is negative for each of them and negative for the rest of the world. And so not only do I hope that there is the trade deal coming sometime, possibly by the G20 at the end of June, but that it does somehow calm down the underlying things that have grown on the back of it.
Jim, there are slowdown concerns currently, whether it's in the US, whether it's Europe, whether it's China, as you also just touched upon. Again, where does India lie in the middle of all this? How worried are you about the impending recession that a lot of countries globally are calling out? And do you feel perhaps that we might still be resilient on the back of a strong domestic economy?
I mean, I think on a relative basis, yes, that's a quite a rational conclusion of yours. um, but you know, we all live in the same planet. You know, I think that it's kind of slightly dangerous for any of us to think that one place can ignore what's going on when China and the US start trying to take big chunks out of each other. I think that would be a dangerous thing to consider. But with that caveat, I think you're probably right, especially because, of course, and we haven't touched on it at all yet, but the past few months, there's been a dramatic change in the market's anticipation of Federal Reserve monetary policy. And oddly, if the continued trade dispute and the uncertainties that go with it add to the likelihood that the Fed abandons all ideas of tightening monetary policy for the future, that is generally very supportive for all emerging, so-called emerging markets, and particularly somewhere that has the internal qualities that the Indian economy and markets do. So, you know, with some hesitation, because I think we're living in a more uncertain time for markets than we have for many years, I think India might be able to stand up better than many other markets, yeah.
So then, can we safely say, so Jim, that all these factors combined then do imply that we're all set to perhaps achieve strong growth potential over the next 5 years?
You know, again, I'm going to give you contradictory thoughts. You know, India has done so well already, as you know, the past 5 years relative to many other so-called emerging markets. It's sort of difficult for me to think that India could repeat the same kind of relative success over the next 5 years. However, it could still happen, and if Modi were to now come forward with bolder reforms, including some of the things I touched on earlier, then I think the Indian markets would do really well, because what makes it so exciting, you know, goes right back to the whole core of the BRICS story, that at this time, as we come towards the end of this decade, the relative demographics for India compared to a China start to improve more and more in India's favor. And if you combine the labor force dynamics with measures to boost reform and therefore perceptions of productivity, the circumstances in principle for Indian markets to do well would be really strong. But you know, I throw back in the caveat that we've already had a good 5 years plus a very strong Indian relative outperformance, and these things don't just carry on forever. But I think given how well markets have done without that much dramatic policy reform, and how easy it is for me whenever I sit down with a piece of paper and think, you know, India could easily, in principle, grow by 10% for many, many years. Yeah, it could happen. And I hope Modi's advisors and his influencers think that way.
Well, at least a strong possibility. Jim O'Neill, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Great to get your perspective once again on some of these key developments. It all really hinges on Modi's reform agenda. That's the clear message coming in order to take India as a more credible, growing economy in the global landscape. That's all from Jim O'Neill, but we're going to take a very quick break and come back with more corporate news on the other side.